That's better. How is everybody tonight on this Monday night, the 9th of October? I think that might be John Lennon's birthday. God rest him. How's everybody? I've just had a weird kind of a day. I was editing there a while ago, audio, and we had a power surge, and even though I'm quite well protected, I think all the editing went down the pan. Went down the tube. I know there's always got to be a way. There's always a way of recovering, but I don't know. So, we're at chapter 20, so there ain't much further to go in this wonderful Ideas Have Legs. Look at the state of it. Well, that's what it looks like. I mean, it is. This copy is actually from, as you know, if you've been following, 1945. That's Peter Howard and his family. The late Peter Howard. So, Chapter 20. We Need New Men. Right, just checking everything is shipshape. You do not judge a nut by its shell. You do not value a jewel by its casket. And in the same way, the outside appearance of a man's head does not always reveal the quality of the interior, which is fortunate for some of us and not so good for others. When I was at Oxford University, often I saw two large feet encased in shiny black crinkly boots coming round the corner. Some distance after them, the owner followed. There was a strange-looking gentleman. His blue eyes peered out of the world over a wispy grey beard, through thick-lensed spectacles, which gave them the appearance of the headlamps of a motor car. Behind them was packed one of the finest pieces of mental machinery in the world at that time, for he was B.H. Streeter, Provost of the Queen's College, one of the most brilliant scholars of the age. He had the charm and eccentricity of genius. His chief parlour trick was limericks. He used to invent them and recite them on the spur of the moment to suit any occasion. Always he stood on the towpath beside the Queen's College boat at the start of the bumping races, and encouraged with some epigram or wisecrack. Once, when they were trying to catch a corpus boat, he remarked, "Habeas corpus," and they did. B.H. Streeter was a doctor of divinity. He was the leading authority on the four Gospels. He wrote books on philosophy, history, comparative religion, psychology, ethics, and mysticism. It has been said of him that he was almost the only British intellect in his field, recognized as possessing the authority of genius by the professors of continental universities in the interwar era. He was at Oxford during the early days of struggle, when Frank Buckman was at work there building up and training the leadership destined to carry the Oxford Group message all over the world. For years he watched the work grow. Finally, on July 11th, 1934, he rose to his feet at a public meeting in the Oxford Town Hall and said, "My attitude towards this movement has been what diplomats call a benevolent neutrality. I now wish to say publicly that I ought to cease from an attitude of benevolent neutrality towards what I have come to believe is the most important religious movement of the day." 3 years later, he wrote, "By 1934, I had seen enough of the group to realize that it was making bad men good and good men better faster than any other movement, and I decided that it was my clear duty to step into the boat and handle an oar, instead of continuing to shout from the towpath a judicious mixture of criticism and encouragement." Streeter sought speed, for with his insight and his knowledge of the trends of history, he foresaw catastrophe unless a new spirit spread swiftly enough to plant changed motives of living in millions of human hearts. Working with the group in Scandinavia, for the first time he realized that this change of heart can move with matchless speed, swift enough to outpace the outcoming forces of materialism. Streeter said, "Modern civilization can only be saved by moral revival. But for this it would suffice if every 10th of every 100th was changed. For each such person raises the level of those whom he touches in the home, in business, and in public affairs." The first news I had of the developments in Scandinavia, which gave B.H. Streeter hope, was contained in a newspaper paragraph. I saw it in 1940, while I was still in Fleet Street. It said that Fredrik Ram had been arrested by the Nazis. I was interested because Freddy was a brother of the Black Craft. He was a Norwegian journalist with an international reputation. He flew over the North Pole in an airship with Amundsen. He was a jolly, rollicking bulk of a man with a first-rate mind. He used to visit Fleet Street from time to time. I made some inquiries about his arrest and discovered an amazing story. In October 1934, C.J. Hambro, the president of the Norwegian Parliament, asked 100 of his friends to meet him at a hotel outside Oslo. About 1,000 turned up, and Freddy Ram was among them. He travelled up to the mountain hotel with a young Englishman. "What is going to happen up there?" Freddy asked. "Miracles, and you'll be one of them," was the reply. It came true, for the meeting called by Storting's President Hambro at the hotel outside Oslo was the first meeting of the Oxford Group in Norway. It meant the start of a new journey for Freddy, which eventually led him to his death as a result of the treatment he received in a Nazi concentration camp. But before that, it produced results which made the Norwegian foreign minister say, "When the truth is told, Ram will go down in history as one of Norway's greatest heroes." Describing 4 years later what happened to him at that hotel outside Oslo, Freddy said, "I told God, if you exist, I am willing to let my life be run by you. God began in me by extinguishing all hatred, all negativity, and all fear in my relations to other people, classes and nations, and just as if the miracle were 4 minutes old and did not lie 4 years back in time, I remember the liberation which came to me, and how the ice in my heart melted, and a new and unknown feeling began to grow, and a love of men unfettered by what they could give me." Freddy became a uniting instead of a divisive force in Norway. He began in his own home asking his wife and children's forgiveness for the coldness of the years. Next, he turned to his old journalistic and political enemies. His motto had been, "Strike first when you suspect anybody of being an antagonist. Strike so hard that he falls. Strike again so that he does not recover." There was no love lost between the Conservative and the Farmers' parties. Yet, a year later, Freddy, the Conservative, travelled to Denmark with Melby, the founder and president of the Farmers' Party, so that both could heal their breach with the Danes. This breach had arisen from a dispute over the historical rights to Greenland, which had been referred to the Hague International Court and decided against Norway. Freddy, with some friends, had so stirred up hatred against Denmark in his newspaper columns that there was danger of a deep rift between the two countries. Now Freddy climbed onto a platform at Odense, Hans Andersen's birthplace, and told 3,000 Danes that he was sorry for his hatred of their country in the past, which had now ended. It was Norway's National Day, when the nation celebrates the anniversary of its free constitution. This marks Norway's breakaway from Denmark. Yet Freddy, the Norwegian, asked his audience to join with him in singing the Danish national anthem. There was a moment's hush, and then without a word of prompting from anyone, those 3,000 Danes sprang to their feet and burst into the Norwegian anthem, so the walls shook with the sound. The impact of the group in Norway itself was swift and decisive. The group's idea caught the imagination of the youth, just then subjected to a bombardment of unexampled power from the isms of left and right. When the group first arrived in the country, the rector of Oslo University welcomed their influence, saying that the student body was being assailed by subversive moral and political forces, and that he was powerless to stop them. In another great educational institution, the Institute of Technology at Trondheim, the Student Council had for 7 years been dominated by Marxist elements and other political extremists. The year after, Trondheim chose a student influenced by the group to be president of their Students' Representative Council, and at the National Students' Conference, and at the National Students' Conferences of 1935 and 1939, it was remarked in the press that the Oxford spirit dominated the conferences. So came true the words of 4 Oslo professors in 1934 in the London Spectator. The coming of the Oxford group will prove to be a turning point in Norwegian history. They have come at the strategic moment with the right answer. Who can estimate the effect of this new spirit in the heroic fight of students, professors and teachers when the Germans came? Among other results achieved through the work of Ram and his friends in the year before the outbreak of war with Hitler are the following. They bore out the view of President Roosevelt that there is no problem, social, political, or is it Roosevelt? Probably Roosevelt. That there is no problem, social, political, or economic, which would not melt like snow before the fire of a great spiritual awakening. 1. Taxes, a flow of conscience money, unofficially estimated at 7 million kroner in the first 2 years, began as a result of the application of the standard of absolute honesty in many lives. A Supreme Court advocate, 5 years after the group's coming to Norway, stated that every fortnight since that time his office had been engaged in some conscience money as a result of the group's work. 2. Morals. Arbeiderbladet, the Daily Worker, and Beisjøreren, the City Missionary, remarked on the decrease in prostitution. The demand has sunk because so many men found the secret of clean living and happy family life through the Oxford group. In 1937, the legitimate birth rate showed an upward tendency for the first time for 30 years. The president and secretary of the Norwegian Midwives' Union publicly attributed this to the rebuilding of sound family life through the Oxford group. As typical of many cases, a cashier in an Oslo bank voluntarily confessed to an embezzlement of 108,000 kroner, which had gone many years undetected, and announced that his action was due to the Oxford group. 3. Church. Storting's president Hambro, writing in November 1944, stated that Frank Buchmann was the catalyst who made possible the United Church Front in Norway during the war. Have we got a delay on camera? Probably. We'll see. Hopefully not on audio. Sometimes there's a little lag. I digress. Bishop Berggrav, since 1937 primate of the Norwegian Church, was at that mountain hotel near Oslo with Freddie Ram. He was a focus of attacks by Professor Halesby, the head of the conservative and fundamental element. The two men did not love each other. The rift between them symbolized a split through the whole church. The day war broke out in Europe, Berggrav, who like Freddie had learned that God can direct a man's thought, sat in his study. Suddenly, luminous and compelling, the thought came to him. There is a war in Europe. There is also war between you and Halesby. Go and see him and make peace for Norway's sake. The bishop was a big enough man to pocket his pride and obey. From that simple action, coming as a climax to years of faithful and inspired work by the Oxford Group, sprang the fighting and unbreakable unity of the Norwegian churches, which were the admiration of the world, which were the spearhead of resistance against the Nazi invaders, and frustrated them at every point during their occupation. That is what Quisling, who had left the communists to lead the Nazis in his own country, meant when he complained that the whole soul of Norway had been poisoned by the Oxford Group, while Berggrav described the Oxford Group in Norway as the most important event since the Reformation. So it is not surprising that the Oxford Group was banned. The reason given was that it was part of the British Secret Service. Freddy was at the core of the Norwegian resistance to the Nazis. He stood at attention and sang the Norwegian national anthem as the Nazis marched through Oslo. He wrote a series of articles called "What to Do in the Blackout." The Nazi censors thought they must be harmless with such a sensible title and let them go through. Then they tumbled to it, and Freddy was arrested. He was put in a room with a rope across the middle of it. They offered him golden freedom if he would quit his religious convictions. He refused. Then a Gestapo chief came in. He said, "I am the prosecutor." He read out a list of charges. Then he hopped over the rope and said, "Now I am the judge," and sentenced Freddy to death. Later, he was reprieved and sent to Hamburg. He was kept there 2 years, most of the time in solitary confinement. His rations were meagre. The Germans offered him more food and a measure of liberty if he would make munitions for them. He refused. Finally, he began to die. The Germans put him on a train to go back to Norway. As the train crossed the Danish frontier, a friend put a little Norwegian flag in his feeble hands. It stayed there till the train reached Odense, the scene of Freddy's great reconciliation with the Danes. There, Freddy died. His memorial is the impact of his work on the life of a nation. It will be seen in the years ahead. Freddy well illustrates the leadership which this age demands. It did not rest in power or position, but in the power of change. The miracle in the mountains transformed him from a partisan into a patriot. He takes his place in history because he led in change. He saw, with the prophetic conscience that God gives, the needs of his nation, and by changing to meet them, pioneered a philosophy of greatness for the millions. Another example of this new leadership is Pim van Doorn, a young Dutchman. He was a creature of fire, colour, life. In 1937 he was an undergraduate of Leiden University and a leader of the student body, although he had interrupted his career to enlist with the Ethiopian army, fighting the Italian invader, and to join the French Foreign Legion. He met the Oxford Group at the Dutch National Assembly in Utrecht Market Hall in May 1937. Later that year he sold what he had so that he and 5 other Dutchmen could take part in the moral rearmament campaign in the Scandinavian countries. When the Germans invaded Holland, Pim was allowed to continue his studies at the university, but his fighting faith was more than a match for the alien ideas which the conquerors brought with them. He waited for his chance to join in the war of arms. Meanwhile, he fought the battle of ideas every day. When he graduated, the Nazis ordered him to work in a munition factory or serve in their army. He determined to escape to England. With him in his pocket, he took maps of all the airfields of Holland. But on his way to the little ship which was to take him to England, he was captured. After a brief imprisonment, he was shot. While he awaited execution, Pim wrote the following letter to his father and friends. "Looking back, I am extremely thankful for my life, above all to God for the way He has led it and has made me live magnificent things. I shall shortly be happier than you. Don't be sad, but rejoice in this grace. I pray that you may accept my departure in peace, and that there may be no premature revolt, that I may not be a cause of sadness, but that strengthened by it you may all put your shoulders with greater devotion to the common task. Pym's life and death is a symbol of the new spirit of youth, which will make Europe rise again out of the ruins. His spirit, strong and without bitterness even in death, will march on in the hearts of thousands of his comrades, and point the way to a Holland finer and greater than before. This is the leadership of the future. It goes to ordinary men empowered by the superforce of the Holy Spirit to do extraordinary things. Frank Bookman has said, "People believe that their leaders should be guided by God, but the rank and file must be guided too. A God-guided public opinion is the strength of the leaders. This is the dictatorship of the living Spirit of God, which gives every man the inner discipline he needs and the inner liberty he desires." Anyone can be such a leader. Recently, there died in Philadelphia a little frail lady of 69 named Annie Yeager. The news of her death sent a tremor to the hearts of millions in every corner of the globe. In castle, cottage and slum dwelling, in countries she had never visited, people felt that they had lost a leader and a friend. 1,100 Londoners gathered in Canning Town Public Hall, birthplace of the British Labour movement, to honour her. Leaders of London's East End boroughs, which had taken the greatest weight of the Blitz, said that Annie's spirit had given them the courage they needed. While 100 families marched up to the platform to announce that she had brought them unity, love and purpose, where there had been distrust and drift before. The Stockholm Press gave this little lady a 2-column obituary. The news agencies flashed the story of her life to papers in all parts of the world, and messages of sympathy for her son were smuggled out of the occupied countries into Switzerland and Sweden. At her funeral, she was carried up the aisle by representative leaders of Labour, while 260 American Labour newspapers mourned this mother of British and American Labour. A typical American comment was, "Rugged steel workers in Sweden, thousands among the now silent people of Europe, members of Parliament at Westminster, civic leaders throughout East London, workers in the Lockheed and Boeing aircraft works, men in Washington, employers and organisers, soldiers and civilians with their wives and children will mourn the passing of a fearless prophet and true friend. Annie Yeager was a great and gracious lady, with as big a heart and as fighting a spirit as any that her native England has ever sent to these shores." Who was Annie Yeager? A woman born to power, riches, or distinction? A woman educated from youth for the task she performed so well? She was none of these things. At 60, she was a little widow who kept a small shop in Stockport, Cheshire, and worked day and night to earn a living for herself and her only son. Her health was indifferent, and everyone took for granted that her life was doomed to run along the same groove until the day of her death. But the new spirit gripped her. It made her sell her shop and leave her home. It armed her with its miracle-working power and set her tramping from home to home, from labour leader to industrialist, in London, Scandinavia, America, wherever it led her. It transformed her and turned her into a national and international statesman, a prototype of the statesmanship of the future. And that, boys and girls, is the end of chapter 20 of Ideas Have Legs. Tomorrow, as please the Lord, if he spares me, is chapter 21, How to Get It. So if you want to know how to get it, meet me here tomorrow, or as we say in Ireland, a Moirach. I'll see you a Moirach. Good night.